Well, hello everybody, and my name is David Fabianar, and I'm excited to teach this course, Group Discussion, to you. Just a little bit about myself. I have been teaching this subject as well as all the communication classes since the mid-90s, so I really enjoy it still. People say, hey, are you going to retire soon? I have no plans to retire, and I don't know why I would stop doing something I really enjoy. So I hope you find that it's interesting and applies to your life too, because one of the things we talk about in our department meetings is that we really emphasize that the quality of communication is directly correlated to the quality of your lives. And so that really gives me a lot of, meaning in terms of what I do. And I want to take this time to introduce you to group discussion and Chapter 1, lay out some definitions, give you some examples, and then there'll be some questions for you in the Canvas, this part of the Canvas assignment. And please email me or Zoom into my office hours if you have any questions at all. All right, so let's move on to Chapter 1, Communication Competence. And communication competence is really focused on in this chapter, and I want to get to it in a second, but first let's look at defining groups and the 3 criteria that's required for group communication. You can see we've made the delineation between interpersonal and group, where interpersonal communication is the study of 2 people, and how, whether they're, we're studying it from a conflict management perspective, or we're studying it from, how friendships become closer and closer with self-disclosure. That's really the focus of interpersonal communication. But group communication, it requires 3 people, first of all, a minimum, because once that third person comes into the interaction, there can be coalition building if you're making an important decision. That person could be a mediator if there's a conflict. So there's definitely a distinction and a different dynamic when that third person joins the discussion. So obviously it could be far more than 3 people. There's a lot of research done in group communication and discussion about juries. That's obviously an area of interest in criminal justice. So a lot of it's done with 12 people. But like we're saying, only 3, that's the minimum requirement for a group. Now, they need to interact in an effort to achieve a common goal, okay? And that's what's different from the aggregation, which is just, a gathering of folks. Here, in the second requirement, you have to have, a common goal of winning a game, obviously if you're a team, or of earning an A on your group project in a class, or if you're, let's just say, a civil engineering firm, of building a structure, a bridge perhaps. So, there's that common goal that is required for a group for our purposes. And then, of course, that you're influenced by each other. And that basically means what you are saying to somebody else carries meaning for that person. So in a group, if you're trying to persuade somebody to see something your way or to gain agreement or adherence, that's, there's influence. It doesn't necessarily have to be persuasion. It could be, you're self-disclosing about something that happened to you, and, the other person is empathizing and understanding. But, there's more than just, greeting somebody who you see at the supermarket and saying, hello, how are you? And the other person says, I'm good, and you walk on, and there's not a sense of being influenced by each other in that context. So let's move on. I hope that's clear. Oh, one more thing too is I wanted to make a distinction. In your textbook they talk about public speaking and how the difference between group discussion and public speaking. And really there's a couple distinctions. Number 1, public speaking is much more formal generally. You usually don't know everybody in the group or everybody in the room. as well as you do if you're interacting in a team or a group, so your remarks are usually a bit more formal. Secondly, there's a clear speaker, and then there's a lot of people listening. So if there's feedback, maybe a Q&A session at the end, it's usually delayed. So it's not, you know, you don't have that give and take that you know, the communication that comes from, that occurs right there in the moment, like you would in a group. It's usually a delayed feedback Q&A session, okay? And that's pretty typical. And lastly, that in a group you generally don't prepare your remarks. You know, you're not practicing your speeches or what you're saying to people in your group. Obviously it depends on the context, but in general, you know, whether you're at work or at school or on a team, you generally aren't rehearsing the things that you say as much as you are if you are the keynote speaker for some topic, okay? So those are really just some definitions of the difference between interpersonal, group communication, and aggregation and public speaking context. So let's move on. So I mentioned communication competence earlier, and really it's a focus of this chapter. And really two requirements for communication competence: effectiveness and appropriateness. Okay? And effectiveness, you can see it's achieving a goal. If your communication achieves the goal you meant, then, you know, for it to achieve, then you are effective. And if you did it with, the rules and expectations of the context, you were appropriate. So let me give you an example. Once upon a time I used to teach in England, and I remember taking a break. I was teaching high schoolers at the time, and so I had about an hour for lunch, and I ran off to this local fish and chip place, and I know it sounds stereotypical, but it's a true story. And I remember eating my meal and having to get back to work, so I asked the lady behind the counter if she would toss my rubbish in the rubbish bin, you know, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you must be a Yankee." And I said, "Well, I'm from the United States, if that's what you mean." She said, "Well, here we don't really use the word toss, because toss it can be meant as another word for masturbation." I said, "Oh my gosh, no, that's," and I'm mortified that we're having this conversation. And so she does toss my rubbish into the rubbish bin, and so it's effective. But then obviously I, wasn't appropriate in my communication. It was not, definitely failed this standard of communication competence, or this definition of communication competence. So obviously that happened because there was a language difference. There was, at least in terms of the Queen's English and the English we speak here in the U.S., but also very cultural differences can clearly impact whether you are a competent communicator. But there's other things that can impact communication competence too, and your textbook goes over these ways to improve your communication competence. And I think that this is a pretty important conversation, especially when you are interacting with folks in your group. Like I said, this applies to your communication interactions anywhere, really, but obviously we're talking about group discussion. So knowledge, you want to learn the rules. So I obviously didn't learn the rules about what was appropriate or inappropriate to say in terms of the language and the words I was using. So I didn't really have that knowledge. I also, I had a skill in terms of, in terms of how to get my rubbish thrown into the garbage, let's just say. But, the skill can also be, I'm speaking at an appropriate volume level. You ever have a conversation with somebody in a restaurant and that person is just far too loud and everybody's looking at you and everybody, people are listening to what you're saying and you're trying to clue that person in to talk a little bit quieter. But there's certain people in my life that I wish that they were aware of how loud they speak. I feel like they don't have the skill to speak in a way that's competent for the context. And again, we're looking at the context, all right? What about those folks who are, and this happens in a group quite a bit, they dominate the conversation. They're not even aware of how much time they take. Maybe you're meeting for 10 minutes in a group, and for 8 minutes they're talking about their own example, their own life, whatever it is. They're just going into monologue is really what I call it. And so sometimes people don't have the skill or the awareness of being other-oriented, of being we-oriented. And you're going to hear that a lot of, how we really want to emphasize the idea of being we-oriented in a group as opposed to just me-oriented. And that can be a skill. It's also an awareness, I think that's something that kind of blurs into sensitivity a little bit, that you can, detect and understand emotional cues. You may know people that, are in a group and they just don't understand emotional cues. So for instance, if you are rolling your eyes or you are, clearly showing that you're irritated or else you think you are, they don't even, it doesn't even dawn on them that this is how you feel, because they're too into their own experience. They're too into maybe just going into their own story and trying to get a laugh or something. But clearly, there's some folks that don't have the sensitivity to really understand, empathize, and read emotional cues, facial expressions, or even if you are, this has happened quite a few times with me where I'm in a hurry. Have you ever demonstrated to someone that you're in a hurry and instead of facing them, you're halfway turned towards the door, but you don't want to be completely rude, and you're like, okay, but your body language is starting to face towards the door because you're in a hurry, and some people will just keep on going and not recognize that you're in a hurry, that you look a little bit concerned, that you're distracted because they're so into what they're saying. So that's part of, I think, skills, sensitivity, that we are other-oriented, that we're we-oriented as opposed to just me-oriented. And some of you, if you don't know people that are like this in your life, it might be you that is me-oriented instead of we-oriented. All right? Another way to improve communication competence is that you consistently try to work at it. That you try to improve. We always can improve our skills. We always can improve our listening. Okay? That's something that I think is really undervalued, and something we'll emphasize in this course is how to become a better listener. Okay? Whether that's a critical listener or an empathic listener, or listener just to listen for details. This is something that you have to have commitment to in order to improve. Okay? I remember, and I'll never forget, my wife, she's so committed to being a better communicator that she would write down notes if she said something that, in a larger family gathering at, the holidays or something, if she said something that might have made my mother frustrated or made a cousin frustrated, and she'd write these things down, and she was committed to, and still is, committed to improving. So you really try to, in a group communication focus or emphasis is, persistence to produce excellence, but really it's just a gradual, how do I get better every day, right? Every time we communicate. And then lastly, ethics, and there, I really like, again, we orientation, you're going to hear this over and over in this course, because it is group communication. It's not just about one person. You clearly want to have that group focus, and honesty, fairness, responsibility, and not forcing or scaring people into decisions. I think that that's got to be emphasized, reminded. I think especially in our political climate, honesty seems to be. I don't know. I don't want to get into that whole issue, but honesty seems to be undervalued, and so I think that in group communication that people will respect if you're trying to do the right thing in terms of your communication, being honest, other-oriented, and obviously not trying to scare people or intimidate people into decisions. So these are ways to improve your communication competence, and this comes out of Chapter 1. And I think that the last thing I want to talk about, because I recognize I need to keep these videos relatively short, is that there is a section about cultural dimensions, really, is what Geert Hofstede talks about. He was a scholar in intercultural communication competence. It's actually there's a whole class taught in intercultural communication, and there's probably 2 or 3 pages dedicated to individualism and collectivism. And what Geert Hofstede did was he studied different cultures, around the world, and what he does is he looks at different dimensions of culture. And so there's individualism, collectivism, let's say, and there's power distance, which has to do with how much regard we have for authority, that some are high power distance where we have this reverence for authority, and some cultures are low power distance where we have it's more equal. There's authority is less revered, and more equality is more important. And obviously it's a continuum, okay? I don't want to go too far into the various dimensions, because actually that's another video that you'll watch. But in Chapter 1, individualism and collectivism is focused on for a reason, because it really impacts this whole idea of the we focus instead of and the me focus. So individualism clearly is, if you look at the definitions, your independence, your autonomy is more important, right? And that's the individual is valued more than the group. And there are various co-cultures in the U.S. mainstream culture that really focuses on the independence of the individual, right? The freedom to do what you want to do, as opposed to collectivism, where it's the commitment to the group. The group is more important than the individual. And obviously, this continuum, where you have extreme individualism and then extreme collectivism, and then there's gray area in between where most of us probably fall, is an important conversation when it comes to group communication and your role in your own group, okay? And so Geert Hofstede identifies this as one of 6 or 7 dimensions of culture that really can be predictors of how you interact in various situations. So if you're, for instance, more collectivist, maybe your co-cultures that influence your behaviors are more focused on collectivism, then you may be a bit more likely to just go along with what people are saying and not make waves, because group harmony is really important. You could have grown up in a house where there's multiple generations, and collectivism and harmony are really important. So you're not likely to cause it, bring up anything that causes disharmony or disagree. And it's just, again, this is, it's not related to any specific ethnicity or anything, but it is definitely a way to look at culture from different respects. Whereas far individualistic, on the individualistic side, you're more likely to speak out for yourself, okay? And you're more likely to, in a conflict especially, I've done a lot of research on conflict management, where if you're towards the individualistic side, you're more likely to speak out about something that bothers you. Whereas, if you're more of a collectivist, like I said, you're less likely to say something. So recognize that and think about your own situations and the co-cultures, which basically the groups of cultures. That could be your family culture, it could be a work culture, it could be an academic culture or a team culture. They all, from a communication standpoint, they all impact the way you behave, perhaps, and that's really what the idea is. So think about individualism, collectivism, and how it could possibly impact your role and the way you interact with your group members, okay? Are you more likely to speak out, or are you more likely to kind of smile and nod and keep the harmony, all right? Anyway, so that's the first lecturette, and I'll be coming up with another one. You'll probably be looking at it next week, and that'll be chapter 2, and I'll look forward to meeting you all, and have a great day. Take care.